Welcome to Northwest Profiles, a look at people, places, and events of interest in the inland Northwest.
Whether it be the rumbling of iron wheels, the rattling of coupling pins, or the hollow sounds of a steam whistle or air horn lingering off in the distance, there is nothing that stirs our imagination of our country's past more vividly than the familiar sounds of a train. The train's role in American history was immense, and although her glory days are long behind her, the train will always remain a powerful symbol of America's rich pioneering heritage. In fact, so profound was the railroad's impact on our country's development that it led one noted historian to write that we can't understand this country if we don't know the story of the railroad. It's a notion that is certainly not without merit, particularly here in the inland Northwest. Like many of the major cities across the United States, the establishment of the railroad here in Spokane was a compelling factor in the city's early growth and future development into a vibrant community. For decades, Spokane's claim to fame centered around the railroad, starting as far back as 1906, when the city featured the world's first AC electric train. Then, just 6 years later, in 1912, the largest railroad complex of its kind west of Chicago began operations in Hilliard.
Most people don't realize that the most powerful steam locomotives ever built west of the Mississippi were built in Hilliard, Washington. That Hilliard, Washington employed around 3,000 people during the Depression. Many people got their paychecks from Hilliard. And if it wasn't for Hilliard, this would have been a worse economy in our history. So many people can identify with the railroads, especially in Spokane.
As president of the Inland Empire Railway Historical Society, and a man who spent 7 years meticulously restoring and remodeling this 3-car train into a Spokane Valley dental office, Dr. John Ryan is acutely aware of the railroad's significant role in building Spokane.
It's probably our most basic heritage, but yet there's nothing in this area that's been the area of preservation for the railroads other than what our historical society has done.
Since incorporating in 1974, the Railway Historical Society has been actively involved in preserving this area's vast railroad history. In the beginning, the direction of the Society's preservation effort was tentative, and at times as uncertain as their next meeting place.
We've met at various places in our early development, underneath banks and various situations, and it wasn't until 1978 when they started to consider disposing of the steam locomotive down in Highbridge Park that our organization solicited a place that would actually allow us to exhibit that if the city would deed it to us. So we had some conversation with the Spokane Interstate Fair manager, Ray Menak, and he asked us if it would be all right if we would consider coming there and to ask permission from the Fair Board. And that's how we arrived at Spokane Interstate Fairgrounds.
Buoyed by the support of the Fair Board and the fact that they now had a new home at the Interstate Fairgrounds, the Railway Society's interest in preserving Spokane's railroad history by deed and action began to materialize. Their first order of business was to design and set up at the fairgrounds a 2-foot gauge railroad, as well as a standard gauge museum, both of which would be operated by the Society during the 10-day run of the Spokane Interstate Fair. Following approval by the Fair Board, track laying for the Fairgrounds Express began in the spring of 1978. And by September of that same year, the Railway Society had accomplished its goal. Today, after 10 years of operating the 2-foot gauge railroad and adding a number of restored items to the standard gauge museum, the Railway Society has set its sights on an even loftier goal.
We would basically like a physical location that's amenable to running at tourist excursions and have a physical location where you can have a museum, a static museum. This is not anything that's new or something that we're pioneering. This is done throughout the United States and it's proven to be very successful.
Considering the Inland Empire's proud railroad heritage, the goal to establish a tourist railroad and museum in Spokane sounds like a great idea and a perfectly natural way to draw the tourist dollar to the community. Yet the proposed project is an extremely ambitious one, particularly for a society whose current active membership is relatively small and whose financial resources are limited.
It was a small group, and basically still is locally, as to active members. I mean, members that actually show commitment and come out to the meetings. Maybe there's sometimes between 25 and 30 members at the meeting, but we do have between 160 to 175 members all over the United States and in Europe. We have various activities in our organization. We publish calendars each year to maintain some funds. We publish books. We do all sorts of activities at the fairgrounds with our 2-foot gauge railroad. Anything that will generate revenue. Now we have a gift shop. But we've looked at everything from bingo to you name it.
Realizing the revenue generated by the gift shop and various other activities wouldn't be adequate enough to fund the establishment of a Spokane-based tourist railroad and museum, the Railway Society approached the local business community for help.
There are some workable plans, but it seems that we have to backtrack into Spokane. We've solicited all the business entities here in Spokane, from Momentum to the Spokane Visitors Convention Bureau to Economic Development Council, and they've said that, it sounds like a great idea, but we're not interested in supporting you. So with this in mind, we did have a study done to determine what physical location outside of this area would be a winner. We're not interested in associating with a loser. We want this to be successful. And the study basically pointed to Wallace-Kellogg area as a tremendous tourist area, having the physical facilities to support a museum of our stature.
Based on the recommendations of the Tourist Railroad Study, as well as the lack of financial support here in Spokane, the Railway Society decided to sell their idea to the community of Wallace.
It took them 5 minutes to decide that they would come up with $1 million to fund our organization. It took them 5 minutes to examine that problem and solve it, where we couldn't even get $50 out of Momentum. So I ask you, where would you go, if somebody offered you $1 million to build a place? It took us 5 minutes to make a decision.
With a verbal commitment from the Silver Valley Development Corporation to finance the proposed project in Wallace and Kellogg, the Railway Society's goal of someday operating a tourist railroad and museum is on the verge of becoming a reality. Unfortunately, though, it won't be in Spokane, which means our loss will apparently be North Idaho's gain. However, regardless of where they eventually end up, the Railway Society knows that the operation of a tourist railroad is impossible without a train. So with that in mind, the Society, over the past 3 years, has managed to collect a number of highly sought-after vintage railroad cars, including this first-generation 1956 Northern Pacific diesel locomotive.
Our first-generation diesel locomotive, which was most graciously donated by the Burlington Northern Railroad, was actively sought after by every historical society basically on the West Coast. We managed to steal that out from under them.
Unlike the NP diesel locomotive, which came to the Society in good working condition, some of the other railroad cars, including this 1914 Union Pacific diner and this 1941 Union Pacific sleeping car, require a fair amount of repair before they can be returned to active passenger service.
Well, the diner, it's a Harriman design or Harriman standard. It has a little different type of both exterior and interior appearance because of that. It was considered to be an economy diner. Originally it had 10 tables. Now it has a lunch counter. And we will have a couple of tables in there to simulate that. The yellow car is a Union Pacific sleeping car. It was donated to us by the Union Pacific also about 3 years ago. And it is now being restored back to become more of a parlor coach combination car when we get done with it.
Along with the diner and sleeping car, the Railway Society is also in the process of restoring 2 1914 Great Northern passenger coaches, one of which is nearly completed.
The one thing that personally I like about this car is the fact that it has such an extensive history. It started out as a new coach in 1914. It was on the Oriental Limited and the other name trains on the Great Northern. Then it was refurbished for use on the new Empire Builder train that was inaugurated in 1929. Then they thought enough of this car that it was still in service with the streamlined equipment in the 1950s, and it was painted in the Empire Builder colors. So it led a very long and successful life with the Great Northern, and that makes it more of a collector's item to me than it would be if it was just a coach that came from some railroad out of this area.
Preserving the past can often be a lonely, thankless job, but fortunately there are people within historical organizations willing to accept that. Here in Spokane, that organization is the Inland Empire Railway Historical Society. Too often, the Society's hard work and dedication over the last 14 years has gone unnoticed, or worse yet, unappreciated. And now it appears the Society's ambitious future plans will probably force its departure. Thankfully, though, for the history buff, and for those of us who simply love trains, the Society's destination won't be far. That's important, because as one writer put it, to remember the railroad as it was, and as it changed, is to know our history in special ways.
If you have a topic for Northwest Profiles, send it to KSPS TV, South 3911 Regal, Spokane, Washington 99223. Northwest Profiles is a presentation of KSPS TV.